Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. In February '94, under the Congress government led by then Indian Prime Minister the late Narasimha Rao, India's parliament passed a resolution declaring Azad Kashmir an integral part of India. A day after the Modi government annexed occupied Kashmir by revoking Article 370, India's Home Minister Amit Shah said in Parliament, and I quote, "Kashmir is an integral part of India. When I talk about Jammu and Kashmir, Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and Aksai are included in it," unquote. Less than a week after Shah's statement, India's Defence Minister Rajnath Singh said, and again I quote, "If there will be talks with Pakistan, it will be on POK," unquote. He repeated this last weekend. The next dialogue will be about terrorism and Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and nothing else, unquote. The latest statement came Tuesday from India's External Affairs Minister, who said, "POK is part of India and we expect one day to have physical jurisdiction over it," unquote. The current Indian Army Chief Bipin Rawat, in a recent interview to ANI, a news agency, said, and again I quote, "The next agenda is retrieving POK and making it a part of India. The government takes actions in such matters. The institutions of the country will work as per the orders of the government. The army is always ready," unquote. For long, India has been marketing itself as a status quo power, and some, even in Pakistan, swallowed this hook, line, and sinker. But it should be clear from the statements above that India, having annexed occupied Kashmir, now has irredentist claims over Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, territories liberated by the people in 1947-48. With the UNGA gone into its 74th session, India's intentions must be debated. All these statements are a matter of record. On 17 September, Suhasini Haider, a senior and serious Indian journalist, tweeted, and I quote, "Given that the Foreign Minister, Home Minister, and Defence Minister have now said that India intends to take back POK, time to believe this is a government policy that will be pursued regardless of the consequences." How should Pakistan respond to this? To discuss the aggressive statements from India, we are joined by Major General Saad Khattak, Mr. Zaffar Qureshi, who's chairman of Kashmir Campaign Global and hails from occupied Kashmir and has been living in exile in London, and also Mr. Hassan Akbar, who is director at Jinnah Institute. Let me kick off with Major General Khattak, who has a long experience of intelligence and operational matters. Saad, give me a sense of the Indian capacity to actually follow through on these aggressive statements and our capacity to respond to this.
I can just call this as their dreams, because not only that I have been in the intelligence outfit for a long time, I have been 4 times deployed along the line of control, and I can very well comment on their capacity regardless of what they are commenting now and then. Yes, they are having numerical superiority. Yes, they would be having superiority in terms of their firepower assets. But I think over the last couple of months, whenever the skirmishes have taken place, I think we have really given them good dose that shows our capacity and our intent, as well as our potential and capability to respond back to whatever that the misadventure that they undertake. So while they are certainly reorganizing themselves according to the environment, but I can tell you that the environment that is building up both on their side of Kashmir and on our side of Kashmir, including in Pakistan, I'm talking of the political and the emotional environment that is taking place, responding to what is happening in the Indian occupied Kashmir. So I think, yes, they would be doing all these, airing all these rhetorics on the media just to perhaps, raise the morale of their people or their forces. But when it comes to fighting, I think they would be fighting a bloody battle, both on the inner front as well as along the line of control. So I think it must be, I can only say that it is more often for the inner gallery that they are giving such type of rhetorics. Yes, as I said, that they have always been numerically superior to us. But when it comes to defending our territory, when it comes to responding to their adventure or whatever, we have the complete capacity in almost every sector of Kashmir that they can attempt to move in.
Okay, Saad, a line of control, there are places where they have a physical operational advantage. There are other areas where we have the advantage. Now, I'm assuming that our plans are geared towards basically enjoying our comparative advantage and plugging where we have certain weaknesses.
Yes, it's both ways. As you have rightly identified, that there are areas where they are dominating, there are areas where we are vulnerable, but there are exactly areas where they are vulnerable. So if they take an advantage anywhere and they poise their forces towards those areas where we are vulnerable, they know very well that what we have the potential to do and where we have the potential to do that. So I think both sides are very well geared up, and it will be, ultimately a no-win situation for neither. So the point is that, and then besides, as I said, that the environment inside is not going to be the same that what they think, it would be for them. So they are going to be fighting a war or a skirmish that is going to be on multiple fronts. It's not going to be an easy thing, easier said than done.
Absolutely. That was Major General Saad Khattak speaking with us about Indian capacity and Pakistan's capacity to respond to any attempts at ingress. Let me go to Mr. Qureshi in London. Mr. Qureshi, you heard the opening in terms of statements coming out of India. But as General Saad Khattak said, the situation within occupied Kashmir is very different, and the Indian security forces will have to cater to that. Do you think that if they embark on a conflict, that their rear will be insecure, that the people in occupied Kashmir will sort of trouble the Indian security forces?
The Indian occupied Kashmir has been involved with the Indian government and the armed forces for over 30 years, for 70 years now. For us, a war or the atrocities they're committing is a daily occurrence. It's reality. It's not something that we need to start thinking there will be a war. There is a war on the ground. And alhamdulillah, the people of Kashmir in the Indian occupied territory have always defended our land, our honor, as well as the Pakistani sovereignty to an extent by giving our lives and stopping those forces from trying to cross. With the current jingoism that the Indian government is, orchestrating around the globe, we have to take that with a bit of a seriousness. Unfortunately, what we have seen as a policy from Pakistan is either defensive or a reactive. Yeah, it is true they might be stronger in numbers or in terms of the armed forces, but at the same time, we need to realize that as a Pakistani nation, what have we done to show our strength?
Pakistani government has been saying from the outset, addressing and signaling to the rest of the world that it is India which has aggressed against the people of occupied Kashmir. It is India that is trying to aggress against Pakistan. All Pakistan wants is through a legal normative framework for the world to understand that the essential issue is about Kashmiris' right to self-determination, and that is where the United Nations comes in. It seems to me that at this stage, this is a good strategy because it shows Pakistan as a responsible state and shows India up in a poor light.
No doubt, I absolutely agree. The movement for Kashmiri people is the right of self-determination. It is an internationally recognized issue in the United Nations. It has been recognized, and especially now, what's been happening on the diplomatic level, a lot more visibility has surfaced on the international community that this is an international issue. But at the same time, we need to realize we have had these negotiations, we've had these statements for the last 70 years. And India, at any cost, is not willing to come on the table to negotiate peacefully. They have always come in forcefully or killed the people of innocent people of Kashmir. They have tortured us. They've been killing us for the last 70 years. Have they really shown any willingness to come on the table and negotiate? Yeah.
No, they have not.
Yes, we do need the international. And this is, that is the reality. Yes, in an utopian world, we would love India to come on table, resolve this issue peacefully, according to the wishes and aspirations of the people of Kashmir and the international community. But the reality is the Indian current government is a fascist, dictatorial government, pretty much based on the pro-Nazi Hitler government, who are hell-bent to make sure that the Hindutva RSS ideology is spread across India, as well as what they call as a Greater Bharat, which includes Pakistan, Azad Kashmir, parts of Afghanistan, and that's where they're going to. And really, we need to wake up and say, okay, that's how India wants to deal with it. Let's actually start talking the same language.
Well, Goldwalker, in his book, said that much before Columbus discovered America, the Indians, they had their government outreach right up to the Americas. So obviously they're living in a fantasy world. That was Mr. Zaffar Qureshi speaking with us. Thank you so much. So we are also joined by Mr. Asad Umar, a former finance minister of Pakistan. Mr. Umar, thank you for being on the program. A couple of questions. One, you must have seen statements by the Indian ministers and also the Indian Chief of Army Staff with reference to India getting, at some point, physical jurisdiction over Azad Jammu and Kashmir, what they call the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And of course, they also refer to the 1994 Parliament resolution, which was begotten under then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. Now, I'm sure the government of Pakistan is seized of this matter, but what is the thinking here? How are we going to respond to this?
Well, India is obviously feeling the heat right now, both domestically, but much more so internationally. What the Narendra Modi government has done is a classic case of overreach, and it's rebounded on them. So in order to, therefore, deflect the attention, they're doing saber rattling. They're making claims which they know that they cannot follow up on. There is no question of India being able to physically enforce their over the Azad Jammu and Kashmir. The risk, however, so there is no risk of them being able to actually do this. The risk, however, is both are nuclear powers. And in the desperation, if any wrong moves are made, Ejaz, if once you move up the escalation ladder, there is time compression between one step and the other. And nobody would knowingly and with full conscience want to move any country to a nuclear conflict. But then you start misreading the intentions of the other party. You start making miscalculations. Misjudgment comes into play. So it's a very, very dangerous road that they are starting to travel on.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. I mean, the history of warfare is essentially the story of miscalculations. And the Prime Minister, as well as the Foreign Minister, have been saying this, addressing, signaling to the outside world. Have we got some traction on this point?
I think there is recognition in the world of the risk that arises. Unfortunately, the world reacts a bit slowly. We witnessed that after Balakot. Initially, the world was slow to react, and it was only after the retaliation from Pakistan, although extremely, what should I say, carefully orchestrated to try and avoid any escalation. But it was only after Pakistan had retaliated that the international community responded. This time, at least verbally, there is a lot more recognition. Global leaders are starting to talk about it. Jeremy Corbyn has not just spoken in favor of the people of Kashmir. He specifically said that the matter should be settled according to UN resolutions. Now, Jeremy Corbyn is potentially weeks away from becoming the Prime Minister of Britain. So that's important. Bernie Sanders in US has spoken along exactly the same lines. We've heard resolutions coming out of international fora. So there is recognition about this issue and the potential risk that arises from it, much more so than I would say has been seen in the past couple of decades.
Okay, let me take advantage of your presence and ask you something about the Indian economy. Now, Indian analysts and, various other voices from within India keep talking about the quote-unquote meltdown of Pakistani economy. But I have these Bloomberg assessments in front of me, and let me just quote from one. And it says, and I quote, "It's hard to fault investors for losing faith. India's economic growth has decelerated for 5 straight quarters to the weakest level since early 2013, 1 year before Modi became Prime Minister, and the 5% headline number for the second quarter may actually understate how painful the slowdown has become. So one of the stories that India has been pushing is that of shining India, high growth rates, a human resource which is highly qualified. And Modi actually said that once he comes in, there's going to be smart cities and infrastructure development, and the Ganges will be clean and the rest of it. Now, how do you, I'm assuming that you also look at how the Indian economy is doing. What is your prognosis?
There are two different aspects to it. One is what you're talking about, which is the relative slowing down of the Indian economy. And that is very real. The domestic pain is being felt. And if you read the economic literature coming out of India and the business newspapers there and the media, you'll hear a lot of talk about the slowdown and the pain that it is imposing. But the fact of the matter is that India is economically stronger than Pakistan. But that's a misleading way of looking at the potential cost of any conflict between the two, or even of tensions arising. India is a far more globally integrated economy than Pakistan is. And in particular, the shining part of the Indian economy, which is the IT industry and the business process outsourcing industry of India, is extremely vulnerable to any risks arising, any tensions arising. And we saw that happening after 2002, when the last time the forces came eyeball to eyeball, there was suddenly flight of business from India. So India is far more vulnerable to any potential conflict arising in the region, and will hurt far more than Pakistan. So on an absolute basis, they may be a stronger economy, but they have got a hell of a lot more to lose if things start to go out of hand, and if the world sees that there is a potential conflict about to arise in this region.
Thank you. That was Mr. Asad Umar speaking with us. A very important point that India's economy is far more integrated. It's going to hurt far more in the event of a conflict. Let me hop across to Mr. Hassan Akbar. Hassan, you heard my opening remarks and also statements from Delhi. Do you think this is bluster? I also quoted Suhasini's tweet where she says that this seems now to be the official policy. Would you agree with that assessment?
It is an Indian policy, Ejaz. It seems that increasingly what they're doing now is that they've created a whole narrative around taking over Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, as you rightly pointed out in your opening remarks. And it's surprising that it is the people who are closest to Narendra Modi, the ministers that are, as we say, the inner circle of policy making in India, who are making these remarks. So these are not some random BJP or RSS members or members of parliament who are making statements claiming that their next policy initiative will be to annex Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. So I think this seems to be a new policy framework that they're setting up. And I see this in two areas. It has a military application, and it also has a diplomatic application. Today, Lieutenant General Ejaz Haider, who used to head their, who was the Northern Army commander, has written a piece which I think is very instructive, talking about this new policy coming from the BJP inner circle. And he says that basically, talking about Indian occupied Kashmir is now non-negotiable. And India, even in bilateral talks with Pakistan, will only talk about what they call Pakistan administered Kashmir. So it seems that they are arguing for both at the bilateral table, whenever and if ever bilateral negotiations restart, that the focus there will solely be on India's claim on Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Kashmir. Secondly, General Ejaz Haider, I think, has written something very instructive. He says that while India does not have the military capability to annex all of Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Kashmir, that it does have the capability to make certain inroads in areas along the line of control where they have better
and he's talked about 5 to 7. He's talked about 5 to 7 kilometers,
and that India should. Exactly, and he argues that India should do that at the earliest opportunity. I think this is very worrisome. Coming from a person as, he's quite a moderate voice from ex-Indian Army officers. And even if he is saying that now they need to follow up on this policy, if we listen to what Ejaz Haider has also talked about, saying that this now is not some random statements by Indian politicians, but in fact reflects policy, because you see it's Amit Shah, the Home Minister, Rajnath Singh, the Defense Minister, Jatendra Singh, who's a very important person. He's the Minister of State for Atomic Energy and also the Minister of State for the PMO office. So he's very close to Modi. Then you have the Bipin Rawat, who's the Indian Army Chief, and you have Jai Shankar, who's their now formerly Foreign Secretary, now their Foreign Minister. This is the policy-making center of Indian and BJP government. The only two people that we haven't heard from is the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval and the Prime Minister himself. So I think it cannot be any clearer for Pakistan that there is an aggressive mood in New Delhi. And I think one of the reasons is because this formula of this Hindutvaized formula of otherizing Pakistan, of being aggressive with Pakistan and with Muslims, has paid off electorally to the BJP. And there's a lot of internal political dynamics that are driving the policy of Narendra Modi, it seems. And so I fear that, we have to take these claims and these statements very seriously. This has serious implications for Pakistan. We must understand also that from our perspective, India has failed to, quell the unrest and the insurgency and the legitimate insurgency in Indian-occupied Kashmir. And it is unlikely to do so because the vast majority of Kashmiris today are completely alienated from India, including those who were mainstream or so-called pro-India politicians in the valley. And as that pressure grows on the Modi government, on Narendra Modi and on the BJP, they will seek to find new avenues to both release that pressure and to change the narrative around the human rights atrocities happening in. So I think it's a real concern and a real fear that in the coming months, we may see greater escalation coming from an Indian policy team that is very, very hawkish.
Lots of people do not know this, and this has been written by Dr. Happy Mon Jacob in his book, The Lion on Fire, about a certain operational plan called Operation Kabaddi, which was discussed at different levels, although no one knows whether it had government sanction, but it was operationally discussed at various levels back in 2001. And this plan envisaged multiple sort of ingress into Azad Kashmir by the Indian Army. So I guess Lieutenant General Panag is somehow sort of talking about, with reference to that, it was never really put into action because, as Dr. Jacob says, then 9/11 happened and the situation kind of changed. But there's also the issue of the Indian economy, Hassan, which we will talk about after I've taken a short break, and we'll return to discuss India's economic slowdown, even though Narendra Modi promised the moon and the stars to the electorate. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Much is being made of India's economic rise and growth figures. Back in 2014, when Narendra Modi swept to power, he had promised employment, continued fast growth, smart cities, state-of-the-art infrastructure, cleaning the Ganges, etc., etc., etc. He went into the 2019 elections with the highest unemployment figures in 4 decades, no smart cities in sight, demonetization blues, squeezed farmers, sliding growth rate. Now, says Bloomberg, global investors are starting to fall out of love with Narendra Modi. After pouring $45 billion into India's stock market over the past 6 years on hopes that Modi would unleash the country's economic potential, international money managers are now unwinding those wagers at the fastest pace on record. They've sold $4.5 billion of Indian shares since June, on course for the biggest quarterly exodus since at least 1999. What exactly is going on? some economists and independent risk analysts have also alleged that the Indian government has been cooking books. Is that correct? We are joined by Arun, Kumar, who's an economist, and Syed Hassan Akbar, who was with us in the previous segment also, and is Director of Programs at Jinnah Institute. And we will discuss the state of India's economy under the Modi government. Let me quickly begin with Professor Kumar here. Professor Kumar, give us a sense of how deep the slowdown is and what the prognosis is.
So, the Indian economy is supposed to be growing at 5% officially, but that data does not include the unorganized sector data, which comes once in 5 years. And the assumption is that the unorganized sector is growing at the same rate as the organized sector, which was no more true after the demonetization in 2016 November. So if you include the unorganized sector data independent of the organized sector data, the rate of growth of the economy is close to 0% or negative. That's why consumption is beginning to fall and demand for automobiles, textiles, FMCG, etc. is tapering off. And the automobile sector has seen a 31% decline in August as compared to previous year August. So all this is happening because of the shortage of demand in the economy, because of which what has happened is capacity utilization is low. And not only is capacity utilization low, but investment rate, which had peaked in 2012-13 at about 36-37%, is down to 30%. And these are the reasons why the economy is doing rather poorly in the last 3 years. And as a result of that, the stock markets have also come down since June 4th when they had peaked. And that's why I think the foreign investors have also been withdrawing the money that, they were investing in the Indian economy. So all told, the Indian economy is in very poor shape. And that's why today the government has given concessions to the corporate sector by cutting back on corporate tax rates, and also tried to attract foreign investors by giving them concessions.
Absolutely. Professor Kumar, I was going to ask you this with the corporate tax cut. The corporates will be happy, but does that have any impact on large consumer base?
No, it doesn't, because you see that the unorganized sector, which is 94% of the employment, which is facing problem. And the corporate sector will increase its profit as a result of the corporate sector tax rate cut, but that will not go into consumption. So today what we need to do is correct for the consumption decline, especially from the unorganized sector. So this extra money that is being given as corporate tax rate cuts, that should have been given to the unorganized sector so that the demand is getting increased. And when the demand increases, capacity utilization increases, and then investment would increase, But at this rate, if you give corporate sector a tax cut, that is not going to boost investment because capacity utilization is low, and therefore the investment will not increase. So by giving this kind of concession, all you're doing is raising the fiscal deficit. And therefore, if you don't want to increase the fiscal deficit, you will have to cut back expenditures elsewhere. And if you do that, then the demand shortage will increase. So the government is in quite a bind at this point of time as to how to manage the situation.
So, Professor Kumar, here's the thing. There's one thing to focus on the economy, restructure the economy, and I'm assuming that's something which India needs right now. But then there are all these tensions between our two countries, and I'm assuming that the markets don't particularly respond too well to that kind of situation.
True that the uncertainty is not good for the markets, but what has happened is that, the political perceptions that have been created, they trump the economic perceptions, So the perception that has been created is that India needs a strong leader, leader that acts, and that, the earlier regime, the leadership wasn't acting. So that's how, the narrative has been built that this is the leadership which is delivering, And that's why, the Indian businessmen also have been and supporting the ruling party, for that reason.
It is one thing to build a narrative, and I perfectly understand what you're saying in terms of the strong leader and the rest of it. But markets and businesses don't particularly like that kind of environment, tensions and putative conflict. And last time in 01-02, when we saw mobilization, the capital had started fleeing Indian markets, and the IT sector was really concerned about where the situation was headed, and ultimately there was a stand down. So I'm assuming that this time is not going to be any different.
you're right that whenever there are tensions, the market does go down. But, this is a situation where, you can create perceptions, You can create perceptions that the Indian economy will do well. And that's how the government is doing that, India is the fastest growing economy in spite of all the problems, etc. And if the 5% rate of growth was really true, then it would be one of the best rates of growth in the world. But as I say, in the last 3 years, the rate of growth has been close to 0% and not 5%. Because the unorganized sector data is not taken into account. If that is taken into account, the Indian economy is not doing well at all.
Thank you so much. That was Professor Arun Kumar speaking with us with reference to the Indian economy. Let me go to Hassan Akbar there. Hassan, creating perceptions. I mean, you can create perceptions up until a certain point, but beyond that, the reality strikes. And when the reality strikes and you have unemployment, which is the largest in the last 45 years, that must have its impact.
Yes, Ejaz, you're quite right. You see, what's happened is that before, if you look at the 2019 elections, earlier this year, in the run-up to the elections, so end of 2018, early 2019, January 2019, there's a lot of reportage on how bad the economy was doing in India. And a lot of analysts predicted that with demonetization and GST having done such a hit to the Indian economy, that would be a big electoral issue. That narrative was what the opposition parties, including the Mahagathbandhan and the Congress, were playing on. But February changed all of that. With Pulwama and then subsequently Balakot, the nationalist agenda of Narendra Modi became the main rallying cry for the government. And they've built on that narrative subsequently. Perhaps that is one of the reasons why suddenly, just out of an election, 3 months into the second term, Narendra Modi decided to go ahead and abrogate Article 370 and create this crisis in Kashmir, which fits in very well with the overall agenda of the BJP of fulfilling this larger narrative and also showing Narendra Modi and his government as a decisive government led by a decisive leader. But you're quite right that eventually the hard-hitting realities of where the Indian economy is going are going to come home. And slowly and gradually that's happening. So far what we've seen is that the Narendra Modi government has not publicly accepted that there is a slowdown. So number one, they have been, their ministers have been claiming that there's no slowdown, the economy is doing fine. But the reality is that, as you say, unemployment is at 6.1%, which is the highest in 45 years. There's a capital flight. And instead of doing fiscal initiatives, which is what one would expect from a government at this point in time, is to create fiscal impetus in the economy by putting in more money, they're actually taking money away from the government and giving it to the corporate sector through corporate tax cuts. Because also, again, the corporate sector is a big supporter of Narendra Modi. They have been financing the campaign, they've been backing the BJP, especially in the first term. So I think there's some element of palpating, increasing concern and worry amongst the corporate sector. Eventually what's going to happen is that people are going to wake up in India to the economic slowdown, to the lack of employment, and there's going to be greater anger towards the central government run by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And then what happens? So you've built this narrative of nationalism, of populism. Today, people in India are saying that Modi is a very decisive leader who makes hard and bold decisions when it comes to Kashmir. But when it comes to the economy, the Narendra Modi government is dilly-dallying and is not making tough decisions and doesn't have a clue as to where to take the economy. So I think these are concerns that are being raised. And in this environment and spectre, with all populist, nationalist, and now a fascist government that is in play, you can easily expect them to turn the tables and to divert the attention of the public from economic worries by undertaking action or hostilities towards an outsider or a neighbor like Pakistan. So I think we're entering a very interesting phase where the overall agenda of the government seems also to be to divert attention. It's also quite interesting that a country that is in an economic slowdown is claiming on international media that the reason why they've abrogated 370 so unconstitutionally, undemocratically annexed Kashmir is to bring prosperity and development to Kashmir, as if the rest of India is doing perfectly good. In fact, Kashmir's development, if you look at Kashmir's growth rates, they're actually better than many other states and poverty rates are much better than in many other states in India. So this whole narrative, this whole facade of India shining and India growing is something that I think will shatter sooner rather than later. And it reminds me of the time in 2004 when the elections happened in 2004. If you remember, you had this BJP government led by Prime Minister Vajpayee, and he ran on a platform of India shining. But the election results came out and they were quite surprising, because people on the ground saw that India shining was only for big corporates, and the poor average farmer, average laborer in India was not gaining any benefits of the economic growth.
Absolutely.
And so they brought in a Congress government. And in this term, I feel that I think the same dynamics are going to play out. There's only so the pressure will be on the BJP, because it seems that their economic team is also not up to the mark.
And also, frankly, I have to stop here, Hassan. Also, because as I've been at pains to say, the prospect of conflict doesn't really sit well with the markets and the businesses, and I think Narendra Modi ultimately will have to put bread on people's tables and not just work out the supposed magic of this narrative. But thank you. That was Syed Hassan Akbar speaking with us about the slowdown in the Indian economy. Let me just go over to Mr. Nasim Beg, who is the chief executive of Arif Habib Consultancy and has a long experience of financial markets and real economy. Mr. Beg, thank you for joining us. How deep is the slowdown in the Indian economy? And let me just quote from what Bloomberg has reported. And they say the gross domestic product growth slowed to 5% in the 3 months to June from a year ago, lower than economists predicted and below the average 7 to 8% quarterly expansion seen in the past few years. That prompted Goldman Sachs and Citigroup to cut India's growth projection to 6% for the fiscal year through March 2020, although the Indian government is sticking to its forecast of 7%. So how deep is the slowdown?
Well, first of all, I think the big news today out of India is that they've cut the corporate tax rate quite significantly from around 30% to 25%. And that's seen a 5% jump in the stock exchange out there. As regards the slowdown, I believe it's the lowest growth rate over the last 6 years, if I'm not wrong. But so the corporates would be happy. The people at the Indian Stock Exchange are obviously celebrating. But I'd really like to sort of talk about the average Indian, whether in rural India or in urban India. I think that's where the problem is. You might recollect that there were farmers out agitating earlier this year, and although in the electioneering they were promised various things, I don't think much has happened. On the other side, if you see let's say take the main sort of indicator in any economy, automobiles, there's a 40% slump in automobile sales, perhaps anything between 300,000 to say 500,000 job losses because of that. And with this tax rate reduction for the corporates, it does, yes, wonders for the corporates. But really, the average consumer, sort of index is low, and they have an 18% sales tax. They haven't touched that. So I would fear for the consumer that the consumer is really not getting anything out of this huge tax cut. Yes, corporates will benefit. I don't see the corporates using this occasion to start investing in capacity because there's reduced consumption. So I don't know, I mean, if I were sort of involved in the government there, I would have been thinking of how do I bring back the consumer and benefit the consumer, the average Indian on the street, rather than the big corporates. But nevertheless, I'm not an economist. B, I don't really follow the Indian economy, but these are just thoughts that came to me immediately after I saw the huge cut in tax rate for the corporates.
Okay, since you talk about that, there's a couple of things, Mr. Beg. One, back in 2014, Modi's first term, there was a lot of euphoria about, smart cities and the fact that there's going to be restructuring and new infrastructure and employment, etc., etc. None of that really happened. There are no smart cities in sight. The Ganges is still very unclean. Infrastructure investment hasn't really been, on the upswing. And yet, he rode the high tide of Hindutva nationalism and was returned, in the recent 2019 polls with even a bigger majority. However, do you think that this is now going to bite over a period of 6 months? And once again, to quote Bloomberg, in terms, since you talked about the corporate tax rate cut, that the international money managers are now unwinding those wages at the fastest pace on record. They've sold $4.5 billion of Indian shares since June, on course for the biggest quarterly exodus since at least 1999. So it seems to me that the Indian government is kind of responding to that. But since you're talking about the larger consumer base, do you think that Modi is in a position at this time to actually get down to restructuring the economy?
Ejaz, unfortunately, nationalist leaders everywhere are pushing agendas which might get popular votes, at least initially or second time around. But at the end of the day, there's a cost to that. I think India was doing well, and there is a focus on this nationalist, religious thing rather than working with the economy. I think the government is more occupied with what are non-issues for the average person on the street. They've not probably done enough for the economy, and this is being replicated elsewhere in the world as well. So I'm not surprised that Modi and his government are doing the same. Ultimately, the people will pay the price, and obviously this impacts all of us because we are neighbors. The region. I mean, if the region doesn't do well, everyone suffers. And if there are these nationalistic issues created within the region, that too is bad for us. So overall, all the promises that he had made, I think he had a wonderful opportunity. But somewhere he's lost the plot.
So you've been looking at markets for a very long time, doing risk assessment also. How do markets respond to the possibility of conflict?
That's something that markets don't like at all. That's a complete no-no for any market. It creates a lot of uncertainty. It causes disruptions if you actually get into conflict. So no market is going to favor that. Even, I would say, the defense production industry would be wary of that. I mean, they'd like to be able to sell weapons, but not actually have conflict because that impacts everyone. So my point is a peaceable arrangement, pushing for peace, pushing for human development, betterment of people at large is more important for any economy than getting into these nationalistic things and then creating tensions that are totally unnecessary. I mean, I'm sure the Indian defense spending has gone up and it's forced, defense spending in the region to go up. So I don't know what you achieve with this. I could understand if India was a major weapons producing country exporting weapons elsewhere in the world, so it went around sort of creating situations for others. But for itself, it's not helping itself.
Okay, so one of the stories that India has projected to the rest of the world is with reference to a fast-growing economy, a highly developed human resource, and of course the soft power. There's a soft power package which has actually made India interest the world. Now, given this situation, if it is not addressed, and I say if it's not addressed because clearly, as you know very well, the kind of belligerent voices that have been coming out of Delhi with reference to Pakistan, with reference to Kashmir, if it's not addressed, or if there's less focus, how long before this becomes a real problem?
It's difficult to put a timing on things like this. But clearly, if the economy in India is suffering and reducing the corporate tax rate is not going to change it. You want to bring back consumer confidence. You want to bring back jobs. I mean, if the automobile sales have slumped by 40%, and in turn it's meant 350,000 jobs, I think, have been lost. A lot of dealerships have had to close. That's not helping. So it's not the corporate tax rate, it's the consumer. You've got to do something for the consumer. So it really depends on how long the Indian government ignores the average person on the street, whether in urban India or as well as those in the countryside.
In the rural India. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Nasim Beg speaking with us. This is all from Indus Special this week. We shall see you next week. Until then, it's good.